Hello, welcome to the Des Moines Magic YouTube channel. Today's Canadian Highlander video is brought to you by Old Cranky Man Collectibles. Before I introduce these two players, please take a minute to subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click that notification button so that you get notified every time we upload a video. This match is between Joe at the top of your screen playing a mono green deck and Blake at the bottom. 5-color Enigmatic Incarnation Reanimator. Blake's on the play here and starts with a Dryad Arbor. Joe's turn, he plays a Forest and a Mox Emerald. Joe's points include Mox Emerald, Natural Order, Mana Vault, and Crop Rotation. Blake's points include Demonic Tutor, Natural Order, Survival of the Fittest, and Birthing Pod. Blake starts his second turn by drawing a card, playing a breeding pool, untapped, going to 18. He pays 2 and casts Anilia's Presence on the breeding pool, draws a card, and passes a turn back to Joe. Joe plays a Thespian Stage and passes the turn. Blake untaps, draws a card. Blake casts a Bitter Reunion, discarding a Titan of Industry and drawing 2 cards. Blake plays a Marsh Flats, 1 life, and sacrifices the Marsh Flats, going to 17. Blake searches his library for an Underground Sea and puts it into play untapped. Blake taps the Underground Sea and casts a Ponder. In response, Joe flashes in an Endurance. Blake doesn't like the cards he sees with the Ponder, so he shuffles them away. Draws a card for Ponder, and then Endurance resolves, targeting Blake. Blake shuffles his graveyard and puts it on the bottom of his library. Joe untaps, plays a Forest, and attacks Blake for 3 with Endurance. Blake goes to 14. Joe casts a Magus of the Order. Blake untaps, draws a card. Blake plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. Casts a Natural Order, sacrificing Dryad Arbor. Blake searches his library for Atraxa, Grand Unifier. Blake shuffles his library, and Atraxa will now reveal the top 10 cards. Blake reveals a Cavalier of Dawn, a Blood Crypt, a Faithful Mending, a Polluted Delta, a Lotus Petal, an Animate Dead, a Titan of Industry, an Archon of Cruelty, Jewel Thief, and a Flooded Strand. Animate Dead, Faithful Mending, Archon of Cruelty, Lotus Petal, and Flooded Strand into his hand. The rest of the cards go on the bottom. Blake plays a Lotus Petal and discards Archon of Cruelty to hand size. Joe untaps and draws a card. Joe plays a Forest, activates Magus of the Order, sacrificing Endurance and searching his library for a green creature card. Joe puts Tyrannex Rex into play with Magus of the Order. Joe taps 4 and casts a Galta. This is the turn back to Blake. Blake untaps, draws a card. Blake casts Animate Dead on Archon of Cruelty. Joe sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 3 life. Blake gains 3 life and draws a card. Blake plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and activates Bitter Reunion, giving all of his creatures haste. Blake attacks with Atraxa and Archon of Cruelty. Joe sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 3 life. Blake gains 3 life and draws a card. Joe takes 12 and goes to 1. Blake activates Lotus Petal and casts the Modern Age. He draws a card, discards a Flooded Strand. Joe draws a card, plays a forest, and concedes. Blake wins game 1. 2, Blake mulligans to 6 and puts a card on the bottom. Joe starts with a forest, a fast bond. He plays an Eye of Ugin and loses 1 life. Ugin does not tap for mana, so Joe puts the mana vault back into his hand. Blake plays a snow-covered island. Blake plays a Preordain. Blake is on top and draws a card for Preordain. Joe untaps, draws a card. Joe taps the forest to play Mana Vault, and he passes back to Blake. Blake untaps, draws a card, casts a Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards. Blake puts 2 cards on top with Brainstorm. Plays a Scalding Tarn and activates it, going to 19. Blake searches his library for bad lands and puts it into play untapped. Casts a Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards. Blake discards an Archon of Cruelty and a Touch the Spirit Realm. He passes the turn back to Joe. Joe untaps, draws a card, and passes the turn back to Blake. Blake untaps, draws a card, plays a City of Brass. Blake taps 2 mana to cast a Persist, putting Archon of Cruelty into play. Joe sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 3 life. Blake gains 3 life and draws a card. Blake passes the turn back to Joe. Joe untaps, draws a card, taps 4 mana, loading 2 colorless. He plays a Sakura Tribe Elder. Joe activates the Sakura Tribe Elder. He searches his library for a forest and puts it into play tapped. Joe passes the turn back to Blake. Blake untaps, draws a card, attacks Joe with Archon of Cruelty. Joe discards a card, sacrifices a creature, loses 3 life. Blake draws a card, gains 3 life. Joe takes 5 damage from the Archon of Cruelty. Blake plays a Savannah. Blake taps 3 mana. Casts Fable of the Mirror Breaker, creating a 2/2 Goblin Shaman creature token. Joe untaps, draws a card, and concedes the game. Blake wins the match 2-0.